Hello everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Jasmine Afawi, and I am the Managing Director here at Save Your Skin Foundation. And welcome again to today's webinar, which will discuss the drug approval process starting from clinical trials to public reimbursement. Our expert speakers today are Louise Binder and Dawn Richards, and Kathy will present them in just a moment. But before that, I'm just going to talk about a few logistics for our Zoom call today. All participants in the audience for today's webinar will be in listen-only mode, meaning we won't be having discussions, and you should be on mute. We will have a Q&A portion towards the end of the call, and to facilitate this, there is a Q&A portion at the bottom of your screen where you can type in your questions. Feel free to type in your questions while the presentation goes on. We will start from the top of the box all the way to the bottom when we get to the Q&A portion. If we don't get to answer your question during this webinar, we will answer it at a later date via email. Now, that being said, I will let you guys know this is being recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel as well as on our website on saveyourskin.ca. The French version of this webinar will be available at a later date on both the YouTube channel and on our website, sauvetapeau.ca. Now, with that being said and done, I would love to introduce you all to our founder and president of the Save Your Skin Foundation, Kathy Bernard, who will say a few words and then pass it on to Dawn Richards. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jasmine. I would like to respectfully acknowledge that I am located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Say Elks Okanagan Nation. Again, thank you everyone for joining us today. It is my honor to introduce Dawn Richards. Dawn Richards, PhD, is the founder of 502 Labs, Inc., and Director of Patient and Public Engagement at Clinical Trials Ontario. With a PhD from the University of Alberta and experience in a variety of roles during her past 20 years, it is her diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis in 2006 that started her journey to combine her passion with science with making the most of her diagnosis. In her role at CTO, Dawn is charged with executing on CTO's strategic pillars of patient and public engagement. Without further ado, over to you, Dawn.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and thank you, Jasmine, for having me this evening. Before I start, I would also like to give a land honoring. I am privileged to live, work, and play in the city of Toronto. And that is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And Toronto is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. As a white settler on this land, I am extremely privileged to, as I mentioned, live, work, and play here. And I also feel it's my duty to honor the land, to learn from those whose home it was before me, and just to continue to enjoy the beauty that I'm surrounded by every day. So without further ado, I will start sharing my slides. So I'm going to share with you some basics about clinical trials. And first of all, I'll tell you a little bit about the organization that I work for. It's called Clinical Trials Ontario, or you might hear me just refer to it as CTO. And CTO is mostly funded by the province of Ontario, the government of Ontario. And you can read about the vision and the mission, but basically it really is to make Ontario a better place to do clinical trials. As Kathy mentioned, my role is the engaged strategic priority. So it's really to help people understand more about clinical trials, help them make decisions about trials that make the most sense for them, and also help them contribute to clinical trials if they'd like to do that. The other two strategic priorities are that we help streamline the processes around clinical trials while maintaining their high quality nature. And we promote Ontario as a place to do clinical trials. I want to take this opportunity to note that while I work for a provincially based organization, clinical trials are nationally regulated. So everything that I will talk about today applies to clinical trials all across Canada. So tonight, I'm going to give you some basic information about clinical trials, how they work and why we do them, and some information that might be helpful if you're considering participation. Everything that I will talk about is on CTO's website. This is a screenshot of it, and I can share the link in the chat when I finish talking. It's important for me to let you know that all of the public-facing information under the Patients and Public tab of our website has been co-created with patients as partners. So the whole idea there is to help make that information more relevant, easier to digest for people, and hopefully it's the type of information that they're looking for. So what are clinical trials? They are a type of research, and that's important for people to know. They're a type of experiment, and it's one that involves people. The second thing to know is that clinical trials test what we call health-related interventions. Intervention is a fancy word for therapy or treatment, and along with testing that treatment or therapy, we test its outcomes in people. And we answer specific questions with clinical trials. We're going to talk a little bit about that later. They're designed to answer specific questions. And so we often use them to answer questions like, is the treatment safe? Does it improve or even maybe cure disease? Or does it help people live longer with disease than treatments that are already available? And does it help people feel better? Does it improve their quality of life? Does it help them do the things that they want to do? And I think that many people often think about clinical trials with respect to drugs, and we're going to talk mostly about them with respect to drugs, but there are other treatments that are studied in clinical trials. And sometimes they're studied on their own, sometimes they're studied in combination with others. And so we've got listed here drugs. It might be something like a medical device, like for example, an insulin pump that would be tested in a clinical trial. Might be a new type of surgery that's maybe compared to a surgery that's already out there. Might be a type of radiation therapy. It might be a new diagnostic procedure or some type of imaging. And it can be things like diet and lifestyle. So it might be a specific formulation of some type of food supplement, might be an exercise study. So really, it can be a lot of things in addition to drugs. So you might be thinking, well, Big, what? Why do we actually do clinical trials? And that's a good question. So we do them to provide evidence or data around the intervention that's being tested. And that evidence or data that's generated really helps us to decide what therapies or other interventions might work best for people. So this data that's generated gives a lot of different people the opportunity to make decisions about interventions. So it might be the specific investigator or researcher who's doing a study, or maybe it's a company, so a sponsor. And the data from the clinical trial might help them decide if they're actually going to continue studying that intervention or not for a variety of reasons. The data might be used, for example, by Health Canada or other regulators to make decisions around what are safe and efficacious interventions. Might help decision makers and policymakers decide, what's covered on provincial formularies. And I know that Louise is going to talk a bit about the policy side of things. And it might also help healthcare providers decide how to treat their patients or have conversations about what therapies are available to people. So just through a clinical trial, lots of different people have access to data that can help them make decisions in different ways. So even though we can think about interventions for clinical trials that are studying clinical trials being different things, I'm just going to focus for the sake of simplicity on the phases of clinical trials when we're developing a drug. So A drug that starts in phase 1 may or may not make it through this pipeline, and that depends on the data that's collected at each of the phases and whether that's considered successful or not, or maybe it's related to funding and other things. But we'll generally look at these 4 different phases. And you can see that they involve different numbers of people. They will often take different amounts of time. And as I mentioned before, we design studies so that they answer specific questions. So let's take a closer look at each of these phases. So phase 1, these studies are done in small numbers of people. This phase you may also hear referred to as first in humans or first in man. And maybe that's not appropriate. Let's go back to first in humans. And so it's done a small number of people because this is literally the first time that the drug is tested in people. Important to keep in mind that while these individuals are taking a bigger risk because this is the first time the drug is taken by people, often for a number of years, the drug is studied in a preclinical phase. So it's studied at the bench for many years. It's studied using specific cell lines, might be studied in a number of different animals as well. So we generally have a good idea of how it will behave, but we never know until we put it into people. So as I mentioned, these people are taking a slightly bigger risk participating in studies because this is the first time that the drug has been given to people. So we're really looking here at safety, a bit about dose, and obviously side effect. Usually phase 1 studies are done in what's called healthy individuals. So they might not have the disease that's under study that the drug is for, but that depends. And I'm going to speak about each of these phases and kind of the generalities, but there can be some different circumstances around the different phases as well, depending on the drug that's studied, the disease it's for, a number of different reasons for that. So small number of participants, usually these aren't very long studies, and these individuals are really closely monitored. And that's important to know that in clinical trials, the people who participate are closely monitored and carefully followed. So if the people doing this study take a look at the data and it's deemed that phase 1 has been successful, it may or may not move on to phase 2. Like I said, for a number of reasons, could be funding, could be a number of decisions that are made. If it does move on to phase 2, these are studies that happen in a slightly larger number of people. Usually these happen in people who are living with the condition for which the drug is intended. And here, the goal is to look at the efficacy. So basically, does the drug do what it's supposed to do in people living with that condition? And throughout the different phases, we learn more about the dose, and we learn more about the side effect profile of the drug in this case. So these are done in a larger number of participants, phase 2. Sometimes you'll hear it's phase 2A, phase 2B. Sometimes you hear it's a combined phase 1-2. So that's what I was mentioning, that there can be some different things that happen between the phases as well. And this might take a longer amount of time, partially because you're recruiting a larger number of people to the study. So let's assume that our hypothetical drug meets its phase 2 endpoints and moves on to a phase 3 study. So phase 3 studies happen in larger numbers of people. Again, here participants are assigned by chance to one of the interventions, and that random assignment is done to reduce bias when we look at the outcomes related to the interventions. Here we're looking to see how long the effects of the drug last. And like in the other phases, we're continuing to learn more about the proper dose and the side effects of the drug as well. It's for a larger number of participants, and partially because of that, these may take longer to recruit for and to complete. When you hear the acronym RCT, that stands for Randomized Controlled Clinical Trial, and that's when 2 or more interventions or so-called treatment arms are compared against each other. So those are phase 3 studies. They're often referred to as a gold standard in terms of the evidence that they produce. After phase 3 studies in Canada, a sponsor or investigator can apply to Health Canada for so-called market authorization. And so they can apply for it to be marketed broadly and approved, what we consider approved in Canada. So phase 4 clinical trials happen after market authorization. And so this is basically when the drug is on the market and it now has a chance usually to be used in many cases by thousands of people. Depends on the indication though. So like in a rare disease, that's not going to be tens of thousands of people. But for this reason, it's also often called post-marketing surveillance. So it's after the drug has been formally approved to be on the market by the regulator. And this is where we look at the drug in a large number of people. And this provides us the opportunity to look not only at the long-term side effects, so phase 4 studies can go on for many years, but we also just can see in large numbers of people how the drug performs, so to speak. So these are for very large numbers of participants. Okay, so that's kind of the basics about the phases of clinical trials for drugs. As I mentioned, while something might start in phase 1, it may or may not make it to market. It really depends on how the data look throughout the studies. So part of a person's decision, if they're thinking about participating in a clinical trial, is no one really can tell you if a clinical trial is right for you. That's a really personal decision. You might lean on healthcare providers or family or friends to help you make that decision. But really, that's a personal decision for you to make. These are some of the things that we think are important for you to know in terms of making that decision. So the first point is that a couple of red flags about clinical trials is if you're ever asked to cover the cost of the study treatment or to pay for the healthcare providers to provide you with the treatment, or almost like an entrance fee for a study. I answered a question a couple of weeks ago for someone who was asked literally for thousands of dollars for access to the study treatment. And that really should not be happening at all. In the cases of clinical trials, the costs for the clinical trial should be covered. There might be some out-of-pocket things that you have to pay for. Maybe you have to drive to the site. Maybe you have to pay for parking. Maybe you have to take a day off work, so to speak. But you would not be required to pay for the study treatment. So that's something that's really important. Another thing that you should look at is the qualifications of the clinical trial team. So for example, has the principal investigator been working in this area for many years, or are they a specific specialist, or do they maybe have ties with an academic center? Important that the clinical trial application in Canada has to have been reviewed and approved by Health Canada to take place in Canada. It might seem like a weird question to ask, but it's totally within your rights to ask if the trial application has been reviewed by and approved by Health Canada. It also needs to be reviewed and approved by a research ethics board. So as an example, if the site at which you're considering the study, like if it's a hospital site, it has to have been reviewed and approved by that hospital's research ethics board. Again, completely good for you to ask that question. And the clinical trial also has to be reviewed and approved by the institution or the organization where it's taking place, because ultimately they're responsible for what happens within their premises. So if you feel satisfied with all of those things and you're interested in the study, you also have to meet what's called the eligibility criteria to be in the clinical trial. And I'm briefly going to talk to you about what that means. So you can think of the eligibility criteria as kind of like the qualification set that determines whether or not you can participate in the trial. So some of the examples you can think of are, you might have to live with a specific disease or condition. You might have to be within a certain age range to participate. You might have to be close to a specific location because there might be a number of visits that you have to go for. You might have to be a specific ethnicity, and there may be other eligibility criteria, but those are some examples for you. In addition to eligibility criteria, you might hear inclusion and exclusion criteria. And so inclusion criteria is the characteristics that are needed to be part of the trial. So an example here might be within a cancer clinical trial, you might have to have specific genetic characteristics, for example. And lastly, exclusion criteria. These are characteristics that don't allow your participation in a trial. And these are often, I'll say, to make the data cleaner, for lack of better words. So for example, pregnant women or pregnant individuals are often excluded from participating in clinical trials because the condition of pregnancy can really affect how they might respond to an intervention, or having other specific health conditions might exclude you from participating. So in my case, for example, the COVID-19 vaccine trials, people with specific immunocompromised conditions were actively excluded from the vaccine studies because of the medications we were on, and that might have an impact on how the vaccination would impact us. So those are a few examples. We often get asked, if my healthcare provider offers me a trial, do I have to participate? And the answer is no, you don't have to. So they might bring a trial to you if they know that you're interested in trials or they think might be a good fit for you. But as I mentioned earlier, it's a really personal decision that ultimately is your decision to make. And this should not affect the care that you receive. It doesn't matter what your decision is, your care should remain the same with your healthcare provider. Another thing that I'd like to talk to you about is the concept of informed consent. And many people think informed consent is signing a piece of paper and consenting to be part of a study. And it's actually much more than that. So it is an active, ongoing process. Consent is voluntary, and you can withdraw that consent at any time, even if you've agreed, obviously, earlier to be part of a study. It is an ongoing process, so you should be actively updated throughout the study, and you should feel free to ask any questions that you need answered as you're part of the study. If you do decide to withdraw consent, so leave a trial, you can also request the withdrawal of your data and any biological materials that you provided. And depending on the study, that may or may not be possible, but you can certainly request that. So also important to know about withdrawal. So as I mentioned, you can end your participation at any time in a clinical trial without needing to provide a reason. You might be asked for a reason, but you don't need to provide one. You are encouraged to make sure you talk to the study team about your decision. So maybe they can answer questions and help walk you through making that decision, or maybe they can reassure you about things and you change your mind, and that's okay too. You might be asked for questions about your experience in the study, and you might be asked to have specific lab tests or physical exams for the intent to help you safely start the study. And again, you can ask for information that was collected about you or samples that were collected from you to be withdrawn from the study. But as I mentioned, that may or may not be possible. So I think that's it for me. I just wanted to leave you with, we're happy for you to visit our website. Everything again that I provided to you this evening is under the patients and public pages. It is available in both English and French. And I am always happy to be contacted after the fact. I know some people will have questions here, but I like to leave my email address. I'm always happy for people to contact me and answer any questions you might have after the webinar as well. So thanks a lot. And I'm going to pass it back to Kathy, who will bring Louise on for us.
Thank you, Dawn. That was very informative. I just want to remind everybody that we will do the Q&A at the end. Next, I would like to introduce Louise Binder. Louise is a lawyer, a health advocate who has been involved in informing the development of health policy and systemic treatment across practices from a patient perspective for more than 20 years. She started her work in this area in the HIV community in the early 1990s after her own diagnosis and before effective treatments were available for HIV. She co-founded the Canadian Treatment Action Council in 1996, which successfully ensured access to treatments and quality care for people living with HIV by working with the federal and provincial governments and other relevant stakeholders to enhance drug review and approval systems, pricing policies, and access to liver transplants for this community. She wrote a paper on universal drug coverage a decade ago while chair of the CTAC. She had a special interest in women's issues, chairing the Ontario Women's Organization Voice of Positive Women for more than a decade, and has been involved in these issues internationally as well. 2 years ago, Louise began similar work in the cancer area, and we are so fortunate to have her as our health policy consultant at Save Your Skin Foundation. She has been recognized by many organizations for her work, including receiving an honorary doctorate of laws from her alma mater, Queen's Law School, the Order of Ontario from the Province of Ontario, and 2 Queen Elizabeth II medals. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce Louise Binder.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you to all of you for joining us and in whatever time zone you're in. I also would like to acknowledge that I am in Aurora, which are the traditional lands and treaty territory of the Chippewas of Georgina Island. They are Anishinaabe peoples and one of the first First Nations reserves in Ontario. I'm grateful to them for sharing their lands with us. So I am going to talk to you about jurisdictional roles in Canadian drug access and the impact of social determinants of health. This is a very crowded space, and I'll try my best to get through this as quickly as I can, but it is complex and probably explains why it takes so long for us to get drugs into our hands. There's kind of 3 tiers to health management processes. There's the law and public policy, which is laws, procedures, guidelines, regulations. There are the implementation pieces to a tier, which is the health systems planning and management and health delivery. And then, if we're fortunate, there's a monitoring and evaluation process, which is the assessment of the policies and the implementation procedures that have been put in place. And hopefully, by doing so, we create a continuous learning healthcare system. So what does this actually look like? On the next slide, we have a chart that is the complex pathway to patient access. And I keep putting more things on this chart each time I do this, not by myself, but because the governments keep creating new organizations. So Dawn did a terrific job of explaining the drug development process, which is the very first box at the top. Then drugs go through Health Canada review. We now also have something called the Canadian Drug Agency. And to that point, that those agencies are managed solely by the federal government. Then we move into what are called pan-Canadian agencies, and their health technology assessment and health technology agencies. And actually, there is one other federal agency, which is the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board. Then if the drug that we're talking about is approved for sale in Canada through Health Canada and gets through the health technology assessment process, and I promise you I'm going to describe each of these to you in more detail, then it goes down to the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, which is the provinces and territories negotiating prices and other conditions for the sale of the drug in the provinces and some federal plans together. If it gets through that process, it goes down to the provincial and territorial drug plans, and they make decisions individually about whether or not they are going to accept the recommendations to make the drug accessible through public plans. We also have, of course, over to the right side, if you're looking at the screen, we have private drug plans that have their own processes, and we have hospitals that have their own processes. So you can see it's quite a long road from clinical trial drug development that Dawn described, which is a long road in and of itself, to get it through all the processes that will maybe, hopefully, get it to the last box on this page, which is access to patients. So let's take a look at each of these, and I'll describe them to you. On the next slide, we have the question that we're going to answer here is who does what in the public sphere in health. And I'm actually going to talk a little bit of the private sphere as well. So the first thing we should take a look at is on the next screen, which shows you that this is the federal government's role in drug access. It's very important to understand, and very unfortunate, I personally think, that access to healthcare has the powers to provide it have been divided between the federal government and the provinces. I think that's created a lot of the problems that we have in access. So the federal government's jurisdiction in dealing with healthcare is ensuring universal access to doctors and hospitals. Now, under that, it doesn't say how long you have to wait for that universal access to doctors and hospitals. And we've seen through the pandemic that sometimes it's a very long time, if at all. The federal government also transfers payments for health to the provinces. The federal government collects data through its Canadian Institutes for Health Information. And as Dawn was saying, it approves clinical trials. It makes sure that drugs that get on the market are safe, effective, and of good quality. It looks at medical devices, over-the-counter drugs, and also post-marketing. And they can actually remove a drug post-market if it's found to be unsafe. They also regulate the price of drugs through the organization I mentioned, the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board and guidelines. They have the power to develop a, quote, pharmacare plan, which is potentially going to be managed by the Canadian Drug Agency, although their role is not very well defined yet. The federal government manages public health policy, including pandemic policy, and it manages insurance companies' activities. So that's quite a number of things that the federal government does. And I'd just like to say that the one thing you should note particularly is what it does not do is promise to provide access to drugs. And that's except if you get it through a doctor or a hospital. Otherwise, it does not approve the sale of drugs. It does not approve the payment for drugs. That's the provinces. The federal government agrees it can be sold in Canada, and it's the provinces that decide whether to pay for it. So that's the big crunch, I think, for drug access. If we look at the next slide, you'll see that the implementation that the federal government does, they have some particular employees that they have plans for themselves, some of whom I think are on strike at the moment. Specific health strategies. We have an HIV strategy federally. We have a mental health and addiction strategy. We have a cancer strategy. We have very recently a rare disease framework, and very recently a Canadian dental care plan, all of those under the umbrella of Health Canada, and they can provide guidelines. So that's their implementation role. And thirdly is the monitoring and evaluation role, which is shown on the next slide. And basically what they do there, as I mentioned earlier, is they monitor treatments after they're on the market to make sure that they are safe and effective. They monitor excessive pricing. They transfer payments for health to the provinces, as I mentioned earlier. They collect data, and they, in infectious disease, they, through the Public Health Agency, they also collect data. So that's the federal government's role. And as you can see, it is very limited in a sense in relation to drugs. The reimbursement of drugs, in fact, only reimburses directly to its own plans. So let's turn to the provinces on the next slide, and let's see what they're doing. You may recall very recently that the federal government announced that it's going to be increasing health funding to the provinces and territories by $196.1 billion over 10 years. And it's also going to give immediate unconditional funding of $2 billion, especially for pediatric hospitals, emergency rooms, and long wait times for surgeries, because they were so badly, those opportunities for access were so badly smashed during the pandemic. It also, on the next slide, you'll see that in addition to that, there's going to be a 5% Canada Health transfer guaranteed for 5 years. And most interestingly, I think, is that $25 billion will be shared between the provinces with one-on-one negotiations and agreements between the federal government and each province. And they've promised that there will be 4 areas of shared priority for that $25 billion that each province is supposed to spend the money on: family health services, health workers and backlogs, mental health and substance use, and a modernized health system. So these, and the federal government has been clear that the funds that are going to be transferred to the provinces for health will only be given to them if they continue, the provinces, to put investments into health as well. So that's very new. And how it's going to play out, we don't know what these bilateral agreements between each of the provinces and the federal government's going to contain. They may be very different province to province, and they may be entirely different. So unfortunately, I don't know how transparent they will be. So let's move on to the next slide, which talks about another part of that agreement between the federal government and the provinces that they made in February. For the first time, they set up a new role for the Canadian Institutes for Health Information, which is a federal body, and they're going to lead a process with the provinces and territories and experts to review and refine common indicators and develop a broader list for data indicators. And there are quite a few here. And this is, again, coming out of the pandemic. So they're going to look at people who have family health teams or doctors. They're going to look at surgery backlogs, new family physicians, young people with mental health and substance use services, median times for community mental health and substance use services. And on to the next page, there's a few others. People with the number of people with mental disorders who have an unmet mental health need, the percentage of Canadians who access their own comprehensive health record electronically, and finally, the percentage of family health services and other health professionals who can share patient health information electronically. This is a whole new world of a data strategy, a pan-Canadian data strategy. We never have had that before, and we have never committed to a leadership role by the federal government with all the provinces to start to build common information. That's what data is, information about people that will help us serve them better, make better public health decisions, and probably do better research as well. I guess I'll let Dawn decide if she thinks they'll do that. Next slide talks about the policy and implementation plans. So as I've mentioned, going forward, these bilateral agreements are being developed even as we speak. The rare disease strategy that was just announced recently will have to be rolled out, and the provinces will have to buy into this rare disease strategy, since they also reimburse and provide access to drugs. The Canadian Drug Agency role, which we think is related to pharmacare in some fashion at the federal level, will be better defined. This pan-Canadian data management strategy that I've just talked about will start to be implemented. There'll be further engagement of government agencies, including our health technology assessment agencies, in real-world evidence, and they're even getting into limited time reimbursement recommendations. There will be increased development of pay for performance and risk sharing agreements by the provinces negotiating together, so that the contracts that they make to allow the companies to put the drugs out, and the industry and the government will pay for them, the provincial government will pay for them, will not be all the provincial governments paying for them. There will be agreements that industry will pay for some. And there will also be undoubtedly further policies in mental health and addictions, cancer, and all of these areas, because we really have a really serious gaps in the needs there. So this is what I think is going to come out of what I've talked to you about so far at the federal level. It really is moving to the provincial level. So on the next slide, we see that in addition to the federal government doing particular things by itself, having complete jurisdiction, there are some things that the federal, provincial, and territorial governments do together. And one is that they have a joint reimbursement recommendation body for public reimbursement, and it's called the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, and INES, which is the Quebec Health Technology Assessment Agency. So what they do, these agencies, is they look, after Health Canada's approved the drug, they take a look at the clinical data, at patient input, at clinician input, at the cost of the drugs, and they make a recommendation to the provinces as to whether the drug has enough value that it should be paid for by the provinces. It's only a recommendation. The provinces can still decide yes or no to reimburse, which is why we have drugs available in some provinces and not available in others. They also do some joint negotiations for pricing, as I've mentioned, and they are now going to be doing some joint common indicator development, health data indicator development, which I think is going to be very helpful in the long run, but it's going to take a long time for that kind of pan-Canadian data strategy to be developed. So those are the things they do together. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see what the provinces do on their own. So we've got the federal government, we've got the federal government and the provinces doing some things together, and then it comes down to the provinces in drug access. So the provinces, we often talk about are having a patchwork quilt of access to drugs across Canada, and it is that. And the reason for that is, as I've said, that each province and territory makes its own decisions about whether to reimburse drugs, and some do and some don't. They do this, they make their decisions partially on the health budgets that they develop and the drug reimbursement plans that they create. They do it through the development of special programs for particular populations, such as seniors and disease groups, and cancer and mental health being amongst those. And they also have the development of Indigenous health programming for Indigenous people off reserve. So, so that's kind of their framework for making their decision about whether they have the money to pay for particular drugs in their budgets and whether they want to use them to pay for those drugs. So if we look at the next slide, we see that their implementation plans, they implement all aspects of health system delivery, including the hospitals, the private clinics, pharmacies, doctors, public plans, primary care, long-term care, home care, and mental health. They have a very broad jurisdiction in health implementation. They manage the cancer agencies where there are discrete cancer agencies. They manage data for their province. They manage a huge bureaucracy. They manage clinical trials, and they implement public health measures. And now number 7 is new. They are going to be implementing these bilateral agreements in these 4 shared priority areas as of February 2023. So that's the implementation piece. And on the next slide, you'll see that they also monitor and evaluate. They do a lot of budget control to monitor and evaluate quality control. They have health boards and committees, and they have commitments in these bilateral agreements that they're going to potentially monitor and evaluate. But one of the big problems I'd like to point out is that in the agreement creating these bilateral agreements, there is no specific reference to how they are required to monitor and evaluate in each province their success in implementing these bilateral agreements, and there's no requirement for transparency of the results that they find. This is a very big problem for us moving forward. So if we turn to the next slide, so that's the public system. You have the federal government deciding which drugs can come into the country. The federal government decides if the price that the sponsor wants to charge is excessive, and if so, they have to reduce it. And then they move it to a pan-Canadian group that decides if the drugs that have been approved have sufficient value that they should be recommended for reimbursement by the provinces, and then the provinces make their decisions about drug access. So it's really a long road and quite bureaucratic. There's also private insurance, and there is an insurance act that manages insurance, and CLIA is a group that sort of represents all the insurance companies. Generally, implementation is through contracts that the private insurance companies make with employers and unions, individuals on every aspect, including drugs. And they also work a lot with benefits consultants and human resource professionals to look at trends and what they should be considering of value to put in their contracts. And the federal government monitors them. So if we turn to the next slide, some of the trends, I've told you some of the trends that I see coming at the federal level, and some of the trends that are going to happen, I think, at the provincial level. I think we're going to see more privatization of healthcare delivery. I think we're going to see a strengthened data management system, but that's really going to take time. There's going to be, I believe, a development of more fulsome cancer strategies, the development of the implementation plans for the 4 shared priorities. I think we're going to see a reduction in public healthcare coverage for certain populations. We're already seeing it in some provinces. We're going to see an increased alignment between private and public coverage. Private people always bought private insurance because it gave them something better than, more than the drugs that were being reimbursed by the provinces. I think that gap is narrowing significantly, and that's a real problem for employers who are trying to use their private plans as a way of hiring and retaining employees. And there's going to be a much greater impact of social determinants of health on health incomes, on health outcomes. So if we look at the next slide, I'd just like to take a minute to talk about those social determinants of health. They are everything from the most macro things in our environment to our individual selves. So if you look at this sort of rainbow, you'll see that the purplish, blue purplish, large outer area shows us that general social and economic, cultural and environmental conditions in our lives do impact our health. And then there's the green area shows us some more specific things within that great environment that impact our health. So education, food, work environment, living and working conditions, unemployment, water and sanitation, healthcare services, income and social status, literacy, housing. They all impact health. If you don't have them, you will have poorer health outcomes. Then after that, in addition to those two, social and community networks impact our ability to have good health, because it's really important to have social supports and cultural supports when one is making decisions about health and when one has health needs. And last but not least, we have our individual lifestyle factors, such as our race, biology and genetic endowment, and culture. They can also, our age, sex, and our constitution, how we're built, also makes a big difference to our health. And we can't leave out things like racism, physical environments, and culture as being also very impactful on our health outcomes. So looking at this another way, if we look at the next slide, you will see, I thought this was a very nicely describes which of these social determinants of health has the greatest impact on your health outcomes. So 50% of your own life, your income, your education, social exclusion, the things that race, Aboriginal status, all have an impact. 50% of how you do, how healthy you are, is impacted by your life, as that list shows. 25% of your health outcomes are dependent on your healthcare. So you need access to healthcare and healthcare systems, and you can't have wait times. 15% of your ability to stay healthy is based on your own biology and genetics, and 10% is based on your environment, including air quality and civic infrastructures for people. So it's very interesting to see how which of these social determinants of health have the most impact. And it's clear that the most impact are those that are often the ones that we could do better about as a society. They are societal, and not just individual, but the others are not. So that's really important to, housing and having a social safety net, having income, having an education, all of these things impact. And our governments, provincial and territorial governments, and in some cases federal governments, do have the ability to make policies and implement them that will help with all of these problems, which in turn, such as housing and income, which in turn, food is a big one, as we know now, and that in turn will impact your 50% of your ability to stay healthy will be impacted by those things. So the government can do a lot to help us stay healthy or not let us get sick. So if we turn to the next slide, I am not going to pretend for a second to be able to speak to the issues for Indigenous populations in health. That I will just say to you that there is federal and provincial government shared jurisdiction and funding for Indigenous populations' health. Colonialism and its downstream effects have created a lack of basic determinants of health and poor health outcomes for many Indigenous populations. Indigenous populations have created principles by which they want health and anything to do with them to be created and implemented, and that is that they have ownership, control, access, and possession of whatever it is that you're doing. And so the message is, in any work involving Indigenous populations, they must be part of that work project and lead all decision-making throughout that work or project. So that's all I'll say about that. That this is a, we know this is a profound and discrete stream of health issues to be discussed. And last, I would just like to talk for a minute about something that's being talked about a lot more these days, which is trauma-informed healthcare provision. You're going to start, if you haven't already, you're going to start hearing a lot more about this. So what is trauma-informed healthcare provision? It's the recognition of the impact of trauma on populations and individuals, especially those with lack of access to social determinants of health, and the provision of services to respond to that trauma in those populations must be safe and culturally appropriate. So the 6 key principles of trauma-informed approach to healthcare provision are safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, cultural, historical, and gender issues. And we are just starting to really understand how important these are to health outcomes. So with that, I would say I take you to the next slide, which is the question slide. If you have questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. And certainly you can always contact Save Your Skin Foundation after this presentation, and I'll be pleased to answer any other questions that you have or discuss any issues that might be of interest to you from this presentation. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Louise and Dawn, for presenting to us today. So we are now at our Q&A portion of tonight. And sorry, it's just going to... I'm going to stop sharing that for just a second. So I am going to invite both of our panelists to show up on our lovely screen right now. Amazing. Thank you so much. So let's go over some questions that we do have. I do see we have 5 of them right here. We are coming towards the end of our time allotted. So let's try to go through these as much as we can. And again, if we're unable to answer your questions, we will answer them via email. So let's start off with the first question. This one is from Tina Robinson. And the question is, if a medication has been approved in another country, do they typically start at a stage 1 in Canada, seeing it seems harder to get Health Canada approval versus the FDA?
Yeah, I kind of think I know what the question is, so I'm going to take a stab at it, and I hope I can answer it. I think I'll say a couple of things. Drugs can be approved for medications in Canada, even if the clinical trial didn't take place in Canada. So Health Canada will allow submission of data packages that's happened in other jurisdictions. So I think that might be what the question is. I can't comment as to whether Health Canada is a more difficult review process than the FDA, but things often come to Health Canada after they go to the bigger markets for approval. So they often come to Canada after they've been approved in the European Union, the FDA, and other places that have much larger populations than Canada does. So that may be a hint as to why things do get approved later, often in Canada versus other jurisdictions. There is evidence out there, though, about the length of time that things do take, and generally in Canada, because we've got many different processes like the ones that Louise went through. And so I think it's generally a 1 to 2 year process in Canada for things to get through the whole system, so to speak. So hopefully that
could I say
answered
something about
things.
cancer? Sorry, can I say
Go ahead,
something
Louise.
specific about cancer? Recently, Health Canada has joined 5 other countries, including the United States and some European countries, to create something called Project Orbis. And what that does is those 6 countries agree to do, each one agrees to take one piece of the review process and do it for all those countries. And then they come together and share their information. That does speed up the time that a drug, but it's only cancer, that a cancer drug would get into Canada, hopefully, at least through Health Canada. The only other thing I'd like to mention is that there is, I know this isn't your question, but I want people to know about this. There is a way that if a drug has not been approved in Canada yet, that an individual may be, but it has been approved in another country, that an individual may be able to get access to it. And it's through something called the Special Access Program, which is managed by Health Canada. Health Canada, your physician makes an application to Health Canada. If the drug manufacturer, if everybody agrees, if Health Canada agrees and the manufacturer agrees that they'll give you the drug, then you may be able to get it. However, one caveat is that the sponsors, manufacturers don't have to commit to paying for it. So you may have to pay for some or all of that drug. So it's just, to keep that in mind.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so our next question here is from Joanne. So Joanne wants to know, there's a few questions actually within this one, but what about when you fail at one clinical trial and then you attempt to get into a second trial and you are refused and have to pay the fee independently? Is there a way to circumvent this? Are people made aware of this? If one trial does not work, that it may rule them out of the next trial. So ladies, what are your thoughts on this question here?
Louise, I can start if that's helpful.
Absolutely.
I think it is good for people to know, Joan, so thanks for bringing this up, that if you do go in a clinical trial, you may not be able to get into another clinical trial because of maybe something you took within the clinical trial. So it all depends on those eligibility criteria and those exclusion and inclusion criteria for each trial. I'm not quite sure about the comment about paying the fee independently, so I'm not going to make any guesses there. But to your point, it is important for people to consider when they do decide to be part of a clinical trial that it may affect their ability to be in another one.
And so to the first question here about price points, yes, governments have a say in price points of medications. First of all, the federal government has a say through the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board. And what that body does is it looks at the price that the manufacturer wants to charge when they bring the drug to market in Canada, and they compare it to 11 other relatively comparable countries in terms of size and the way they set up their healthcare systems and so on. And it's the median of those 11, the median price of those 11 that is considered all right for the pricing in Canada. Anything above that is considered, quote, excessive, and they will not be able to charge more than that median price. Oh, sorry, then of course, I'm sorry, I stopped at the federal government. How could I stop there? Then, yes, then the provinces and territories have a second say, because they don't just accept that price that the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board chooses. They look at it from what they call a public value perspective. So they look at the price and they look at the drug and they look at a lot of factors, clinical factors and patient input, and they give a recommendation to the provinces about whether the price is of the drug, given what kind of drug it is and so on, is it of enough value to each province that the province ought to reimburse it publicly. And then the third chance, kick at the can, well, the fourth actually, this third, but there are four. The third kick at the can is through the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, which is where they look at the recommendations about value and they sit together as provinces and territories and negotiate a price behind closed doors. We never are involved in those negotiations. And then if they come to an agreement, the fourth lens at a public level is each province on its own. So even though PMPRB at the federal level may have said the price isn't excessive, even if the health technology group has said it's a value to be reimbursed, we recommend it as a value to be reimbursed, even if they negotiate a price, the provinces and territories that they all agree on, the individual provinces may still, at the end of all of that, decide that they are not going to reimburse that drug. It's so convoluted.
No, you explained it really well. Thank you. So we're going to do one more question, and everyone else, the rest we will answer at a later date via email. So our last question here is from H. Catherall. Louise, do you know what the criteria will be for the rare disease strategy? Dawn, if you are traveling from different provinces for trials, does your medical coverage cover you for anything other than the trial cost if you needed medical support? Thanks for the information presented.
So you're asking about the, what is it about the rare disease strategy?
So she just wants to know what the criteria will be for the.
Oh, okay. I'm assuming she means which drugs are going to be chosen to be in this rare disease strategy. I hope that I'm getting that right. So the federal government has put in an investment of $1.5 billion over 3 years to support this first ever national strategy for drugs and rare diseases. It is hoping that the provinces will kick in some money, and so we'll have a larger pot of money and more drugs can be covered. But what the federal Minister of Health has said very clearly is that it will be only a few drugs. Don't expect it to be a long list of drugs. And I sat in on his announcement, and he spoke quite a bit about pediatrics. So there seems to be a bit of a preference, I suppose, for pediatric drugs, at least as the first drugs in. However, that is not carved in stone. It was just something that he said in an announcement. And what they are going to do is set themselves up an advisory committee that is going to help them to make the individual decisions about which drugs to put into this rare disease strategy.
Amazing. And Dawn, did you want me to re-ask the question? Yeah, perfect.
I
So,
can see it. It's okay.
oh,
Yeah.
perfect. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is about if people are traveling to a different province for a trial. I don't think that I can answer this with a blanket statement. I think you're really going to need to look into that. There's going to be a number of really dependent factors for each different trial, and sometimes some things are covered and other things are not. So I would encourage you, if that's an approach you're thinking about taking, to make sure that you do your homework before you agree to anything there. Sorry, I can't give a more specific answer than that.
No worries. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for asking your questions. Like I said, we will answer the other ones at a later date. I will now give the floor to Kathy, who will close our webinar today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Louise and John, for sharing your insights with us. We appreciate your time today and in preparation for the session. We know how important this information is to our Canadian patients. And to all our attendees, thank you for attending today's webinar session. Again, I'll mention that this session is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the Save Your Skin Foundation website and YouTube channel, as well as sent to all who have registered. This is a reminder that the French version will be available at a later date. If you have any additional questions, please reach out to us by email, which is on the screen, or our 1-800 number. I'd also like to thank all our Save Your Skin sponsors, because without you, these type of events would not be happening. But before we let you go, on the screen, you should be able to see some of our upcoming events. Melanoma Awareness Month is starting the 1st of May, and will include a number of campaigns. We are also having an upcoming fireside chat, which will be hosted by Nigel Deacon, and we'll discuss ocular melanoma. Finally, this year, we're going to try something new. We're going to do a virtual trivia night to close off Melanoma Awareness Month. So thank everybody. Thank you for watching. This ends the webinar session. Have a good evening.